Hello YouTube, Jonas Weefield here once again. And this time I'm here to tell a third story. Yep. I decided to do this a bit early since I'm gonna be having nothing else to do for the next couple months. So, yep. Here we go, the story of gaming. So, back in the late 60s, there was really nothing to do. I mean, there was good music back in the 60s to listen to, but what else were we gonna do besides that? Well, luckily enough, out came something called Pong. Yes, Pong. It was what they called an arcade video game back then, or just an arcade. It was completely wooden, and two people could play on it at once. Basically, it was just two electronically pixelated paddles which hit a pixelated ball back and forth. A virtual version of ping pong or tennis, I would say, but it was fun. Everybody loved it. You didn't have to leave your house to do it. It took very little physical strength or speed to do, and people just loved to go and play it. And that was around for a few years, and well, after a few years, Pong got huge. So, people started thinking, what if they could take the video games home with them? And that's what they started doing, because there was a console called the Odyssey. And it allowed you to play at home on your own TV. And, well, people loved it, just like they did Pong. A lot of people bought it, but it only had 5 games on it. Or 6, sorry, yeah. Games 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you had to put layouts on the screen in order to play the game. And all the games were slightly different in their own way. And this was a hit. A home video game console. It was a hit. Well, people combined both Pong and a home video games console to create the Pong consoles. There were a lot of them. One of them was licensed by Nintendo, and, well, another one had 3 games on it. One Pong, one was a racing game, and one was a shooting game. And really, there wasn't much to the Pong consoles. However, after that came a bit of a big boom in the video game market, because out came the Atari 2600. And that's not all. There was also ColecoVision and Intellivision, which came out before ColecoVision, in order to compete against the Atari 2600. There was the Commodore 64 also, and of course, there had to be an Odyssey 2. The Odyssey 2 was one of the Atari's biggest competitors. Either that or the ColecoVision was its biggest competitor. However, they didn't stand a chance. Every system, the Commodore 64, Intellivision, ColecoVision, and Odyssey 2 were all brought down by the Atari 2600. And the Atari 2600 went well over into the 80s. And it was eventually, how do I say, defeated by a thing called the NES, which we all know what the NES is. Nintendo Entertainment System. Its biggest game was Super Mario Brothers, and Nintendo and Atari worked together, but they had some problems because the Atari 5200, which came out after the 2600, flopped, and the 7800 they were arguing on about what should make it better, so Nintendo split, did their own thing, Atari did their own thing. And of course, there was a new brand called Sega, the Sega Master System. And, well, out of those three consoles, there erupted a slightly small war. Because NES took down the Sega Master System, but before that it took down the Atari 7800. And another problem was it took down the 2600, which had a very long-lasting lifespan, the longest of any video game console ever. And not only that, but it outsold the 2600, so it's the best seller of all time for games systems. But really, to be honest, not all things can last. All things must pass. Because after that came the Sega Genesis. And how do I say, it took out the NES with attack heads and all that. It beat it down, and that was what we call a war. But the NES was defeated fairly easily. And Nintendo wasn't going to let this happen to them. Because they came out with a system called the Super Nintendo to take on the Sega Genesis. And by the way, Sega Genesis, or Sega in general, had a character like Nintendo named Sonic. He was far different than Mario. You could take him seriously, for one. And he had a sidekick, just like Mario did, except it wasn't his brother, it was just somebody he found and rescued named Tails. And, well, it's set up for the perfect war. The Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. It took a long time for this war to finally be over. The Super Nintendo outsold the Genesis by a lot. But the Genesis, or Sega I should say, came out with both the Sega CD and the Sega 32X to add on to the Genesis. So ultimately Sega did beat Nintendo because of all the money it made off of these three things. Not many people like 32X or the Sega CD, and I can't blame them because really the only good game on it, I mean, I do believe 32X utilized the 32-bit graphics instead of 16-bit like the Sega Genesis used, or 8-bit like the Nintendo used, or 4-bit like the Atari used, or 2-bit like Pong used, whatever. Anyways, the only good game out of both the 32X and the Sega CD was Sonic CD. But the best Sonic the Hedgehog game was Sonic 2. Now, what you could do on Sega is you can combine a game called Sonic and Knuckles and Sonic 2, and you can play as Knuckles in Sonic 2, or you could play as them in Sonic 3 if you chose to connect it with Sonic 3. Which I found that interesting about Sega. You could do that on there. I'm not exactly sure if you could do that on Nintendo. I do have a Super Nintendo, but I do not tend to use it that much. Anyways, afterwards, the Sega was still alive after Super Nintendo fell, but Nintendo was ahead of Sega in creating a new console, which they called the Nintendo 64. Yeah, the Nintendo 64. I never had a Nintendo 64. But it did have a couple PS1s. A couple, yeah. That came out around the same time as both the Sega Saturn and the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 easily got rid of the Sega Saturn, sad to say, but then Sega came out with a new console called the Dreamcast, and the PS1 easily got rid of that. So, Sega quit. They called it quits in about 2002, which is around the end of the Nintendo 64 PS1 war, which the PS1 ultimately won. And the Sonic, he still lived. Although the Sega consoles were gone, Sonic the Hedgehog still lived on. That's just how popular he was. But Nintendo made a game called Sonic Mega Collection for the Nintendo GameCube, the new console. It finished off PS1, but then there was a new console, or company making consoles, Microsoft. They created the Xbox. So the Xbox and GameCube went at it for about a year until the PS2 came out. PS2 annihilated them both. It is the strongest game station in history. Ever created. Nothing else to say about it, but it outsold even the NES and became the best seller of all time. After that, the Nintendo Wii was released, and the PS2 was doing good. It was going up against it. It wasn't really winning or losing, but then the Xbox 360 came out, and that's when the PS2 finally fell. Now, what happened after that was PS3 came out, the PlayStation 3. And the Wii somehow got up ahead in front. I guess just because it was motion controlled and everybody loved that. But then PS3 got motion controllers, Xbox got the Kinect, and that pushed Xbox up in the first place and PS3 in second. The Wii died off early, if you believe that or not. And, well, after that was the Wii U, and recently the war between the 360 and the PS3 has ended. It was a long one. Very long one. And, Xbox 360 came out on top, but now there's a PS4 and an Xbox One, and of course Wii U is gonna get booted out, but it's looking like PS4 is gonna have it, and I'm probably gonna get PS4, so yep, it'll be fun. Can't wait to see if there's any new Game Station consoles like if Sega were to release another one, which they said they were a few years ago, but apparently not. And if you're still wondering about Sonic the Hedgehog, he's still going strong today. Mario, not so much, because Nintendo is not going so strong. And that is all. That is the story of gaming. Goodbye, YouTube.